Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Doors in Dialogue, a conversation on the history and complexities of the term Latinx. This event is being held in partnership with the Office for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion and the Office for Inclusive Excellence, and is the second in the Doors in Dialogue series. I'm Teresa Temkin, and the president of the Vanderbilt Association of Hispanic and Latinx Alumni, or VAHLA. We were established in the fall of 2019, and one of the very first decisions we made was regarding the name, Association of Hispanic and Latinx Alumni. Now, the reason we went out of our way to include the term Latinx was we looked to our current student body who have changed the name from, when I was there, the Vanderbilt Association of Hispanic Students, to the Vanderbilt Association of Latin American Students. I'm going to read for you a portion of their mission statement, and I would encourage you to take a look at their website because they're doing fantastic work, even in this all digital world. It says, our mission is to establish a sense of community at Vanderbilt through intentional programming that celebrates Latinx and Hispanic culture. So when we made sure to include this term Latinx, it was in nod to what the students are currently calling themselves. And so we wanted to make sure that that was being recognized so that when they come out of Vanderbilt, they still see themselves as part of this community. Today, we're joined by three panelists, Professor William Luis, Professor Gretchen Selcke, and the current Vice President of the Vanderbilt Association of Latin American Students, Maria Loaiza Bonilla. So with that, I would like to just introduce Professor Luis, who also has a very impressive background. So I'm going to give a very shortened version, which is that Professor Luis is the Gretchen Conaway Vanderbilt, is the seated chair in the, is the named chair of the Gretchen Conaway Chair of Spanish at Vanderbilt University. He was awarded in 2012 to 2013 a Guggenheim Fellowship for his project, The Life and Works of Cuban Slave Poet Juan Francisco Manzano. He has published a number of scholarly articles, including well over 100, as well as 13 books on a series of subjects, including what we're discussing today, among them a piece called Dance Between Two Cultures, Latino Caribbean literature written in the United States, and one that's very near and dear to me as a Cuban American, The Culture and Customs of Cuba. In addition, we're so excited for him to join us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Luis. Thank you.
Profe, unmute.
Thank you, everyone, for organizing this important event. As you know, my name is William Luis, and I've been at Vanderbilt some 30 years now. And I was the first Latinx professor that was hired and went through the ranks. I come from New York City, and the knowledge that I have or that I've accumulated is based not only in my own personal experience as a Latinx individual in the United States, but also as the advisor to the Library of Congress during the decade of the 80s. Everything that was published of and about the Caribbean in literature was sent to me for review. And in that way, I was able to understand how literature responds to the types of titles that we're using today. So my background is in literature, and so I think we all need to somehow ground what we say in some kind of discipline to be able to give it coherence. So there's been a lot of confusion about who is Latino, who is Latinx, who is Hispanic. And one of the confusions has to do, it's a linguistic and cultural one, where the word Latino exists in Spanish, but it also exists in English. However, in Spanish, Latino means one thing, and in English means something else, within English culture, within Hispanic culture. So very, very briefly, Hispanic or Latino, Hispanic also means something in English and the same thing in Spanish. The same word is used, but with two different contexts. So if we start out with the word Hispanic, Hispanic in Spanish means it comes from Spain, or it refers to Spanish culture. So Spanish America or Hispanic America means the presence of Spain or Spanish in the Americas. However, the same term in the United States developed differently as immigrants began to arrive in the United States. They arrived with their own national identity. So Cubans arrived as Cubans, uh, Argentines arrived as Argentine, but as they began to experience the culture of the United States, some of these groups began to coalesce and come together. And so, as I mentioned, Hispanic in Spanish means Spain or refers to Spain, but Hispanic in the United States refers to those people of Spanish speaking origin who reside in the United States within US culture. The term Latino, obviously, as you know, comes from the term Latin, and these are Latin. Spanish is one Latin-based Latin language, just like it is Italian, French, Portuguese, so on and so forth. So a Spanish speaker from Latin America would automatically refer to Latin as Latino America, whereas the word Latino in the US had a slightly different origin. Before Latino came into the use of communities, the operative word was Latin and not Latino. And Latin was used by uh, Hispanics who were born and raised in the United States and felt closer to the country of the adopted country. So I want to make a distinction here, not to confuse too much, but we will use, or I use the term Hispanic of those who are born and raised in a Spanish-speaking country and come to the United States. As I mentioned, they come to the United States with their own national identity. But as time goes by, they coalesce and they begin to find common ground with other Hispanic people. In the New York communities, in the inner cities, the term, at least in the Northeast Coast, the term was Latin. But that Latin, and there was a periodical in Chicago in the 1960s that used this particular name, the name Latin. But then Latin became Latino in the US context. And again, in this particular context, these Latin and Latino refer to people who are born or raised or have are in between state between the country of their parents' origin and the US. So what happens is that when a Spanish speaker gets together with an English speaker and they have a conversation, they use exactly the same word, but they mean it in different ways. What the Spanish speakers mean it in the Spanish context of what Hispanic means and what Latino means, and U.S. speakers mean it in a different context. So this is one of the confusions that we are still dealing with. But what I want to propose is that the term Latin or Latinx or Latino Latinx is a specific term that refers to a particular community in the United States, mainly in the United States, but it's also becoming a more expansive term that goes beyond communities. And so the term, whereas before, or it still does, refers to a particular community in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, although the operative term in the Southwest is Chicano, but that is also changing towards Latin, Latino, Latinx. Whereas before these terms applied to specific communities, the term is beginning to grow and to develop to incorporate others. Who are these others? Other people who, for example, live in Latinx communities, identify with Latinx culture, identify with the politics, with the racial politics of Latinx, and they, in some respect, too, become um, Latinx. So there is a specific use of the term, but it's also an expansive use of the term. The example that comes to mind is one of a writer called Joy Castro, who wrote a wonderful piece about her own experience growing up in Key West. And she was raised by a Cuban woman, and so she identified herself as Cuban. But as time went on, she had the opportunity to meet her mother, and with a lot of anxiety, desiring to know more about her family, she was much surprised when she found out that her mother was from the Midwest and had no Hispanic attachment or origin. But that didn't stop Joy Castro from identifying herself as a Cuban. And so she's a Cuban writer because she believes that that's her identity. She feels that it is part of who she is. And so, what I want to allude to, and later on I'll talk to you even more about more expansive terms, but the term Latinx, Latino can have a very specific reference, but it could also be expansive as well. So the difference, if we would look at the term Hispanic in the U.S. and Latin or Latino or Latinx in the United States, we can look at, as I said before, Hispanic is closer to the country of origin. They're usually people who are very much in command of the language and also uh, the culture, and they are residing in the U.S., but they also have a close contact. The Latinx usually are more US dominant in US culture. And the Latinx is not only a cultural term, but it's also become a political term. It becomes a racial term. And it also has become a gender term. So the term has become more and more expansive, that incorporates racial politics, gender politics, cultural politics, so on and so forth. So this is, I guess, a way of starting out a conversation that we can explore some of these usages. But just to summarize very quickly, we have the word Latino and Hispano in the Spanish language, and we have Hispanic and Latino in the English language. It's the same term, but it defined differently. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. Are we using it? Are we using it in the Hispanic term, or are we using it in the U.S.? The confusion again is that we begin to use it in a particular reference of our own language, but without being aware, are we using it in Spanish? Are we using it in English? And this is where a lot of the confusion comes in. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was very enlightening and great way to start us off, so I really appreciate it. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Gretchen Selcke, who is the director of the Latino and Latina Studies program at Vanderbilt University. They also have a fantastic Instagram, so I would recommend checking that out. Her research interests include Latinx and Afro-Hispanic literatures, as well as social entrepreneurship in Latinx communities. And Professor Selke has also been very much involved in helping VAHLA get started and helping provide us with a reading list. So if you are interested in learning more, I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. Professor, if you would like to go ahead.
Thanks so much, Teresa. I'm so glad to be here today to talk about sort of how Latinx has become the term that it has now. And just full disclosure, Professor Luis was my dissertation chair many moons ago, and I am certainly informed by his influence on my own work. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these terms in a more modern context, perhaps, and I'm going to put my professor hat on for a second. I promise it's only 4 slides, and I promise they're not boring. I'm going to show you 2 really short videos, and I hope that it will help us sort of begin to problematize this term, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and discussion. I see some questions already popping up in the chat. I'm going to follow the format that Beth Porter and Carolyn Johnson asked me to follow, but we'll make sure that we answer your questions. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our student, Maria Loaiza Bonilla as well. Sharing my screen. Again, my name is Gretchen Selcke, and I'm the director of the Latino and Latina Studies program. My plan today is to talk a little bit about why this term matters so much, and I'm going to rely on some popular culture videos to help us. There's a book by Juan Gonzalez called Harvest of Empire, which is one of the texts that we use in Latino and Latina studies to sort of ground our students. We all probably know this, that by 2050, Latinx people will be 1/3 of the entire US population. And we also need to think about the idea of how this group has been historically marginalized because of both racial and I would argue economic bias. Okay, so the first video I want to show you is this Latino or Hispanic video. What's the difference? So without further ado.
Stream 85 plus channels and save up to $500 a year with YouTube TV. Try it free.
Latino and Hispanic, Hispanic and Latino. The two words are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. The difference lies in the words themselves. Latino refers to geography, people who are from or descendants of Latin America. That's this area here on the globe. It includes most countries in Central and South America, as well as some in the Caribbean. 20 countries total, and some territories like Puerto Rico. The term Latin America was first used by Chilean politician Francisco Bilbao in 1856. It was used to describe countries in America whose predominant languages stem from Latin, so like Spanish, Portuguese, French. That's why Belize in Central America and Guyana and Suriname in South America are not part of Latin America. English is the official language of Belize and Guyana. Dutch and Sranan-Tongo are spoken in Suriname. We've recently adopted Latinx as a gender-neutral alternative to Latino and Latina. In the most literal sense, Hispanic also refers to language, people who are from or descendants of Spanish-speaking countries. That includes places like Spain in Europe and some countries and territories in the Caribbean. It excludes countries like Brazil and others in Latin America where the predominant language isn't Spanish. According to the Cervantes Institute, more than 400 million people worldwide are from Spanish-speaking countries, and nearly 10% of those reside in the United States. That's a lot. And that's probably why the US government introduced the term in the 1970 census during Richard Nixon's presidency. So back to the beginning. The two terms shouldn't be used interchangeably because they're not the same thing. You can be Hispanic if you're from Spain, but that doesn't make you Latinx because you're not from a Latin American country. You're Latinx if you're from Brazil, but you're not Hispanic. But you can be both. I'm both. My family is from Mexico, both a Latin and Hispanic country. Now you know.
So I fully admit to showing that at the start of some seminars because I think that it raises the kinds of questions that we're talking about today. But I also think that the term that the BBC uses can be problematic because it doesn't take into that socio-historic component that Professor Luis just explained to us, right? It's definitely an oversimplification of the term. I do find it useful because it talks about why the X. And I think as we talk about bringing the idea of inclusivity into our discourse as academics, that X becomes super important. The next thing I'm going to show you is a little bit more in your face, perhaps more thought-provoking, perhaps more controversial. If you've ever been a student in one of my classes, you've certainly seen this poem, which is often how I start the semester. So just kind of put on your student hat once more and imagine yourself in a classroom at Vanderbilt. This is a spoken word poem by a performer named Carlos Andres Gomez. And the reason that I like this poem is because it echoes where some of the origins of the term Latino as used in English come from, which comes from the Young Lords movement in what was known as Nuyorican New York in the late 60s and 70s, and this idea of spoken word poetry. And I love how Carlos Andres Gomez takes that tradition and makes it modern. Sorry, let me go back.
This piece is called Juan Valdez, or Why is a White Guy Like You Named Carlos? After the show, she asked me, Carlos Andreas Gomez is your stage name, right? I mean, I've never met a Hispanic who looks like you, so what's your real name? Question. What exactly does a Hispanic look like? Do I need to look like Juan Valdez and sell Folgers in the TV commercial? Sift my fingers through Colombian coffee beans I picked myself, sitting on the back of my reliable mule Conchita next to a broke-down Chiva in an oversized sombrero to make it look Latino or like a Hispanic, as you say. What is a Hispanic exactly? I could guess what you mean and assume that it's a low-priced gardening tool like the one buried in the shed behind your Victorian summer home, or that invisible harvesting instrument that picks all of your grapes for you and has to survive on slave wage plantations without unions, bathroom breaks, or vacation. Or maybe when you say a Hispanic, you mean your stand-in parent. That person who raises your kids for you when you're tired of being a mom. That mouthless set of infinite hands and knees that scrubs the crap from your toilets and throws away the leftover garbage when you forget to get rid of it. And I don't have a backyard or a lover on the side, or kids for that matter, so maybe I just haven't had the need yet. But I haven't come across a Hispanic thus far in my life. But I have met Latinos and Latinas. Proud of the vibrant patchwork quilt we've had to weave over centuries across an endless cemetery that cradles our past. A swollen dust underneath our souls, wherever we stand, that we nickname home, twisting roots at war, looking for nothing else but to be held. You know, held? Like a family grasping onto each other, because they've left behind everything and only have each other left. Arriving on Mars without a guidebook or a map, I have met Latinos who people think are Aboriginal in Patagonia, East Asian in Chile, West African in La República Dominicana, Scandinavian, Argentina, Native American in Colombia. I met Latinos who look like Juan Valdez and can't speak a word of Spanish. Others who look like Hillary Duff with a mother who looks like Hillary Clinton, that are from Paraguay and teach Spanish grammar in Puerto Rico. Latinos who speak Quechua and nothing else, dance cumbia like the horizon is on fire because of them, and now they're trying to burn tomorrow to the ground. I have met Latinos who cook like their broken English moms and mispronounce their own last names. Colombians who don't know who Gabriel Garcia Marquez was. Dark-skinned Dominicans who hate Haitians because they remind them that they're African. Blue-eyed Cubans who spit poetry about revolucion and mean it. Living in Miami with two parents who lost their mansions in the 1950s to it. I don't tattoo my body because my veins are already too full with ink. Passion-rich pigments that can help but pulse and flow. You want to know what I am? I am a Latino living in the United States. My name is 3 words that can't be abbreviated. Yeah, I want you to remember all 3. Yeah, I want you to say them like me. And yeah, remember both of those accent marks, baby. My name is Carlos Andres Gomez.
So here, I think that we begin to sort of see why we are problematizing this term. And Carlos Andres Gomez takes a more expanded view of the term Latino, Latinx, and applies it in a way that also talks about the body politic. So here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions that were submitted at registration, and sort of why the term, how the term Latino and Hispanic are used, I would argue perhaps incorrectly in the US Census, and how it's sort of talked about in the cultural zeitgeist, and how we as scholars can sort of push back against a less precise use of the term. Okay, so we know that the voto Latino in the last election was super important, super talked about. And we know that particularly in 5 states, Latino voters were an essential part of the outcome of the election. We know that 5 states are home to 2/3 of all eligible Latinx voters, and that California holds about 1/4 of the US Latinx electorate. And so talking about these terms, especially in light of what happened in the election, becomes super important. Moreover, when we talk about sort of who gets to count and who doesn't. We're talking a little bit about who is defining themselves in which way in terms of their political persuasion. Not to get too far into the weeds here, but we know that this sort of block of Latinx voters is not actually a unified block, and that you can actually parse the block of voters sort of based on cultural of origin and also place of residence, right? So we know that eligible voters who are of Puerto Rican or Mexican descent were more likely than those of Cuban descent, for example, to vote or lean democratically. And that, for example, a majority of Cuban eligible voters, almost 57%, lean towards the Republican Party. And we can talk about how the political machinations absolutely exploited people's perceptions of what politics mean and used what people think about terminology to influence how they might vote. Talking a little bit about the census, you saw a little bit of this from Professor Luis and also from the BBC introduction. Since 1980, the US Census has asked about Hispanic identity separately from racial identity, right? There's this two-part question in the census. One is about ethnicity and one is about race. And scholars like Laura Gomez from UCLA talks about how the census actually exacerbates extant tensions because what this does is it highlights the tension between how people see themselves and how they are seen by members of the dominant group. And people like Laura Gomez talk about this othering that happens, especially when the white dominant group begins to try to define others. So the questions on the census read, are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And the second question is, what is your race? The problem here is that race is ascribed, right? And often assigned by the dominant group. And more than any other group, those answering yes to question one, meaning that they identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish, answered some other race in 2010. So when we talk about how these terms become conflated with race and how Latinx is in fact a racialized term, I think that we start to get to why this term is so important. That is sort of my mini presentation into the beginnings of our discussion today, and I look forward to hearing more from you and to talking about this further. I think we're going to hear from our student, Maria, next.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, with that, we will turn it over to our Vice President of the Vanderbilt Association of Latin American Students. Maria is a fourth-year graduate student majoring in creative writing and minoring in history. And I am so excited to hear more about what they have to say on what ALAS is up to these days.
Hi, yes, thank you for that. My name is Maria. I'm the Vice President of ALAS, and ALAS stands for the Association of Latin American Students. We're an undergraduate organization, and we hope to both represent and then also provide something of a home for students here on campus who identify as Latinx or have some sort of tie to Latin America or don't and are just interested in learning more and sharing all of that with us. We have events throughout the year, just hoping to highlight both educational aspects of what we do, teaching people what is Latinx culture. We have service and activism focus, and of course celebration. And so during Hispanic Heritage Month, for example, we bring in a speaker every year. We had the opportunity to speak to Dolores Huerta actually in the fall, and it was a great conversation. In the spring, when it's not COVID, we have a big dance showcase in a 1,000-person auditorium. It's called Café con Leche. And as an organization, we've done it for 30 years, as Teresa can probably tell us about. It ranges from bachata to tango to reggaeton. And what I love about this event is that it's for everybody. It's for all people. You don't even need to know how to dance, which I benefited from. And so that, we're trying to open up our bubble of who we invite in, right? And so we used to be VOS, before, which was the Vanderbilt Association of Hispanic Students. And I actually came onto the board as we were making that transition that same year. So I got to take part in these conversations. And, you know, as we talked more about like, why are we doing this? Like, why does this matter? Who are we trying to bring in that was left out before? And I realized, you know, it's more than an acronym. And as Dr. Selke and Dr. Luis were talking about, Hispanic and Latinx are very different terms. And so is Hispanic and Latin American. And so I use Hispanic because I'm from Colombia, but it excludes people from places like Brazil. And in talking to students, a lot of them felt more comfortable joining ALAS than they did joining VAS, because VAS to them implied that they needed to know Spanish. And people who didn't have as strong of a command were a little worried, like, oh, I'm not going to fit in here. Which of course is not the case. And so I think changing that acronym has made the difference, you know, at least a little bit between you are welcome in this space and this space was created with you in mind. And so I think now that we've changed our name, students can feel a little bit more comfortable, you know, and feeling like they belong regardless of how much Spanish or if they know Spanish at all. And I think to the extent of that inclusivity, I think Latinx as a term does that too. I am somebody who uses they, them pronouns and she, her. And so I think Latinx as an identifier for me helps me bring these two really important parts of my identity together in a way that I can still hold on to, yes, that English culture of Latinx that is used in that sense. And then also that part of my identity as a Latinx individual, right, in the Spanish context. And so when I see that term, when I use that term, when I hear it, I feel welcome. And more than that, it feels like this space was created with me in mind. This term was created with me in mind. And so funnily enough, I resisted it at first. I didn't like it when I joined the board. Before these conversations, I also didn't understand why. And it felt foreign to me. I had never heard it until I got to this academic space with my peers and stuff. But as we had those conversations, I realized language matters and it's important. And it's not that we are anglicizing this language, is that we are showing the flexibility of it to change as cultures change and as understandings and inclusivity and stuff. And so for me, I've really adopted that term. For me, it's not Latinx, but I combine it more with, you know, Latinx. I identify as Latinx, and that helped make it mine in a way that it wasn't before. So I think that intentionality is key, being intentional about language. And as an organization, ALAS, we try to be, you know, intentional about our terminology, for example, changing our acronym, and intentional with inclusivity in our programming, who our members are and who our audience is. So.
That's fantastic. And I know that I can speak as a former VAHLA or VAS person and a current VAHLA person. I was very glad to see that distinction was made, because 10 plus years ago, we hosted an event on Hispanic versus Latino and what it meant to different folks. And it was sort of an attempt to figure out if we were going to change our name at all. We obviously decided that at the time we had just turned 21 as an organization, and VAS chose to stay VAS at the time. But can you walk us through, Maria, a little bit of that process of becoming ALAS? Was it a vote among the board? Was it a discussion that was happening in the background, or what were your thought processes there?
Yeah, so I think that decision was very much, you know, a priority for us as we came into the new year. I was not on the board when it was decided, but I was on the board when we started implementing it. And there wasn't pushback against our renaming, just because I think it was well understood that it's not like we're changing who we were before, but we're trying to expand and include more people. And so a lot of it just had to do with PR. branding, getting new stickers that say alas. Luckily, alas means wings, so we got a new logo too. But yeah, and so we held a launch event and we reintroduced ourselves. And I think it was a big success. I think we've not forgotten the past as VOS, but instead, kind of modernized it and bring it into our current context.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd actually like to go from there, and everyone please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. We really do encourage them. Professor Selke and Professor Luis as well, can you guys speak to where Vanderbilt stands in addressing Hispanic and Latinx issues comparing to other universities, both in the SEC and across the board?
Profe, I'm gonna start, and I'm gonna let you continue as a sitting member of the Faculty Senate on the Chancellor's Diversity Committee. So I'll let you talk sort of about the institution of Vanderbilt, and I'll talk about peer institutions, if that's okay with you. Is that good? Okay. I became director of the Latino and Latina Studies program in fall of 2019, and I did a lot of research into sort of what other peer institutions are doing. I would argue that our peer institutions, as well as what I would call sort of the Ivies and the small Ivies, are absolutely using the term Latinx in both their centers of study and in their publications. I would also argue that many other centers are taking the X on as well. People are talking a lot about Afro-Latinx world. People are talking a lot about the X as both a multiplier and a marker of inclusivity, both in terms of incorporating the indigeneity of some people with multiple identities, and also about the sort of pan-gender or gender neutrality that the X affords. Lots of scholars who write predominantly in Spanish have argued for the use of an E, like Latine or Latines, before it was an arroba or an @ sign. But I would argue that most people who are writing in English and or are writing across disciplines are adopting the Latinx, frankly, especially younger scholars. And Professor Luis, I'm gonna let you talk about sort of how Vanderbilt leads and or maybe follows some of our peers in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Let me just start out by saying that, if I'm not mistaken, I was the first advisor to the Vanderbilt Hispanic Student Association back in the day. And at that time, we also had, as a student, Shirley Collado, who is the president of Ithaca College, and she is also on the board of trust at Vanderbilt University. So she also goes back to those early days when we first met back then. Those of us who have interest in promoting Latinx students and culture and literature, worked very hard to start the program, of which Gretchen is chairing now. It started many years ago with proposals and really what I would call an uphill battle. We submitted proposals after proposals, and we were told that the proposal structure had changed and we had to go back and redo it. And that took years in order for us to get the program that Gretchen is director. So it's been a long and winding, a lonely and winding road to get where we are now. What we're trying to do, at least in my capacity of direct chair of the, or co-chair of the Diversity Committee of the Faculty Senate, and also a member of the University Diversity Council, what we're trying, or what I'm trying to do, is to try to get additional identity centers set up, which means a Latinx center, an Asian center, a disability center, and so on and so forth, in the same type of structure, hopefully, as we have with the Schulman Center, with the Bishop Johnson Center, the Women's Center. I think our students need that kind of support with an advisor and programs and funds to be able to create activities to promote a particular type of goal, but also open to the community. So everyone who wants to learn or who wants to participate or who feels either centrally or tangentially identifying with a particular culture or identity center would be welcome. This is a way of not only recruiting students, letting them know that Vanderbilt has made a commitment to, in this case, Latinx students, Latinx studies, uh, and putting that commitment into a building, into a center with the necessary advisors and supporting staff to be able to help students. And this, as I said, is not only to recruit students, but also for our students, and not only our students, but also uh, faculty and administrators and supporting staff that want to participate. So this is the present work that we're trying to, or that I'm engaged in trying to get these programs online, and these centers rather.
That's a fantastic goal, and I look forward to seeing it come to fruition. To kind of go from there, and also to speak back to some of the other things that we've been saying, and there's also a number of questions in chat about this. Uh, the program that Professor Selke is in charge of is the Latino and Latina Studies department. And I know that, for instance, again, on Instagram, it's the Latinx VU. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are to those folks who say, well, the X is an academic term and you can't apply a non-genderation to a gendered term. What are your thoughts to all three of you on what that means? I know Maria touched upon it a little bit in terms of that, but I'd be really curious to see, do you see it moving forward as ultimately a Latinx studies department, or is this going to continue to evolve?
I will answer this question because I made the X. I also when I became director, really worked to expand our course offerings, expand our inter-university offerings, and also work with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the now known as SJSCI, to really work on the idea of inclusivity. I think I talked a little bit about why the X. All the X allows us to do, which is not just all, what the X allows us to do is to incorporate the gender of everyone, every person, every human. And it also allows us to incorporate Chicano and Chicanx identities. It also allows us for the indigenous parts of what has historically been known as Latin America. And as this field expands in terms of cultural studies and also in terms of linguistics, depending on your field, that X can represent different things. I think it's important that we remember what Professor Luis said, which is actually the term Latino comes from an Anglicism, right? It was Latin, and then the O was added first in English and later taken on by those who were speaking Spanish to refer to this field. So this is a sort of, it sort of talks about sort of the origins of the term and also the origins of how crossing borders works. I sort of love the X as someone who works in the field because it sort of suggests the elimination of these borders. And when we talk about sort of the politics of those borders, whether they are gender borders or geographic borders or ethnic borders, racial borders, I think that X is an interesting way of suggesting that those borders are permeable.
Yeah, I agree with what Gretchen is saying. The term Latinx, and keep in mind that there is a Spanish equivalent pronunciation Spanish speakers say Latinx, but the term is Latinx in the U.S. term. So keep in mind how these terms are used by Spanish speakers from Latin America or from Spanish America, as they also begin to incorporate these terms and how they're developed in the U.S. in the U.S. context. And I think that's a distinction that I want to insist on making. But these terms to identify our communities have evolved. And first it was Hispanic, and then it became Latino or Latin, then it changed to Latino, and then it was Latin with an @ sign, and now we're Latinx. And I think that this is, for all the reasons that Gretchen mentioned, this is an expansive and an exclusive term, and it crosses borders, crosses gender, crosses politics, crosses race issues, and so on and so forth. But I would not be surprised if the term will continue to evolve. It has in the past, and I think maybe 5-10 years from now, we may be looking at another term that may be more suitable to incorporate some of the things that we are recognizing now, but maybe are leaving out. And the future context will allow us to understand how the other needs that we can't envision at the moment will be addressed. So I look at the term as one that is for the moment, is for the present, but it also has the possibility to continue to evolve and to incorporate other ideas. As I mentioned, we can speak about a community, a Hispanic community in the U.S. that has made the U.S. its country of residence, but also its own country. But then we are also talking about people who are not necessarily totally of Hispanic, but maybe one parent, or somebody who is Hispanic or Latinx. And then we're talking about people who identify with the music, and we're talking about people who identify with the culture and with reggaeton and with all sorts of other things. And so the term begins to become more expansive as it continues to grow and to incorporate other people. And that's why the X is that expansive marker. It's, as we know that in Spanish, you have genders, you have male and female nouns, and so on and so forth. And the X resolves that issue to incorporate everybody, whether you're from one particular sexual orientation or not, or whatever. It does allow for that growth. And so that's why I think it's an important term. It's an important term, I think, for the community, but it's also an important term for academics who are beginning to theorize, because Latinx and Latinos and the program that Gretchen is heading allows for a theory that begins to change or go beyond binary opposite. It's either good or bad. It's either up or down. And knowledge is not divided so easily into one extreme or the other. And Latinx theory allows to break away from this polarity and look at the nuances in between. And so one of my close friends who passed away, Tato Laviera, put together a poem called Ni de aquí ni de allá. Okay, and I'm not from here, not from there. But the interesting thing from my point of view is that that middle space is not an in-between space, but it's a space of definition as well. So it is a new space that incorporates everything else. And so to theorize Latinx and Latinx or Latino or so on and forth allows us to approach knowledge from a different perspective, not from one corner or from the other corner, but from both, or from 3 or 4 and all together. And that will produce a new way of thinking, a new way of envisioning, a new way of teaching. And so this is the exciting thing that Latinx studies is contributing to knowledge, Western knowledge, if you wish.
Thank you. I don't know if you would then say, I mean, I'm going to presume so, that your thoughts on the relatively new term of BIPOC. So for those who are not aware, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Do you think that this is, a fantastic kind of continuation of the term and just that, like becoming more inclusive and making sure that we're really speaking to all aspects of ourselves? Or do you think that it's sort of an unnecessary next step?
No, I think it's again, going back to the idea of inclusivity, and I'll answer the question by making a different kind of reference. Uh, if you identify with what Latinx represents, which is inclusivity. It has racial politics. It has gender politics. It has new ways of envisioning, and indigenous people, especially in the U.S., can find a home in Latinx because it is expansive and it does look to reach out to other communities who are in the same situation as Latinx people are. Now, it doesn't mean that all Latinx people are the same, and let's make that clear. There are distinctions, but it is a way of bringing people together, and the new understandings of Latinx as some are beginning to push the boundaries of Latinx, and we can have a discussion about whether this is the right direction to go. But at the beginning, I was talking about the Cambridge University Press coming out with this 3-volume collection of Latinx literature in transition, and they're looking to incorporate Muslims, indigenous people, Jews, Africans, and so on and so forth. And I'm not quite sure if I feel comfortable with all these with everything that's being brought in, because ultimately I don't want the community to become erased. The term is born from a community struggle, community presence in the United States, a community experience in the US. And if we begin to broaden, I am in favor of incorporating, but I don't want the concept of community to be lost. And then when you begin to talk about, and maybe even bringing in Chinese or other groups or Martians or anybody else that will fit into it, I think we begin to go too far, and we need to somehow make sure that the community still plays a relevant role in the use of the term.
I was hoping that maybe we could get a pick on Maria a little bit.
I was actually
I've seen a couple questions about sort of other courses that intersect with the sort of Latinx discipline on campus, and how maybe you might, not that you can speak for everyone, Maria, obviously, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've noticed as a student about sort of the Latinx community on campus in general. If you want to talk a little bit about what it's like to be you at Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I can do that. I think what's really great about Latinx culture and Latin American is that you can study it very much cross-disciplinary. And so there's a lot of different departments. I know the anthropology department offers culture and power in Latin America. I'm currently in an English class on Latino American literature, which I love. I've taken a few history classes and stuff. And so I think, yes, if you're interested in certain aspects of these studies, there's definitely a class or a place for it. As far as my experience with here on campus, and I think I got another question about what would you say to prospective students? And I think at a predominantly white institution like Vanderbilt, there are times when I've looked around and I'm the only person of color in the room, or looked around and I'm the only Latinx person there. And so that definitely happens. There's a lot of spaces like that here where there's not that kind of representation. And I think there's another question asking about how students can be supported here, and representation is so important. I think I've only had one professor in my studies who has been Latinx, and in one of my writing classes where I was encouraged to explore all of that. And so that's what I hope these classes do, is push for connections, personal connections, and then also to all of these other subjects, as it's a very broad thing. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. And thank you so much, Maria. Yeah, I was actually about to go with you with how we can make sure to support you. I do want to make sure that everyone is aware that actually ALAS will be hosting a volunteer session. So if you are an alumni who is sitting here and going, we need to get more involved and make sure that we're represented so that folks like Maria can feel that they are included on the alumni level and give back to the university and influence it in that way, I would encourage you to attend and get more involved in the affinity groups. With that, I'd just like to see if there are any last thoughts for any of you. Unfortunately, we're about at time, so I don't want to keep anyone. But I really think that this has been a tremendous conversation, and I want to make sure that we continue to give our full support to the Latino and Latina Studies Department at Vanderbilt. So I don't know if anyone has any last words. Unfortunately, there were a number of questions we weren't able to get to, so we'll have to see about hosting another Doors in Dialogue on some of this more inclusive things. I'm very much think it's important to especially discuss some of the gender politic and something else along those lines. So please do, again, if you have ideas, we're also welcome to them. Professors, Maria, if you guys have any last words on today's subject.
I'm so thankful for this conversation. I think it's an important one to have. I think we all know that the Latinx community at Vanderbilt is growing, and we would love to have your support. I saw some specific questions about how to support ALAS and how to support Latinx community at Vanderbilt. I'm not gonna lie, alumni donations matter. There's a giving button on the Latino and Latino Studies page. We'd love to see financial support, but we'd also love to see you representing in other ways, by attending our events, by supporting our students, by contributing to ALAS, by writing to the dean and asking them to support Latinx faculty hires, by writing to the deans or the chancellor and asking them to support the advent of a Latinx Cultural Center, which is part of the chancellor's diversity and inclusivity report, but construction hasn't started yet. We have a Somos VU initiative. So if you see the hashtag Somos VU on any social media posts, if you can help us spread that word. And also talking up Vanderbilt as a place that welcomes Latinx people. I think word of mouth is really powerful. And showing that we are a place where students and faculty and staff as a community are all pushing toward the same goals really does matter. Thank you. And I shared my email in some of the chats with people looking for resources. It was on the slides. I'm sure Beth can give it to you. I know Teresa has it. It's gretchen.s.selke@vanderbilt.edu. And if I don't know the answer, I'll do my best to find it for you.
Yeah, and my parting words was, first of all, to thank everyone for putting this together. But look at this conversation as just as a beginning. There's lots of information that we could also share, and certainly if we go into history and how history has unfolded. But I'll just leave you with just one idea. When you're using these terms, ask yourself or ask the person you're speaking with, are you using it in a Spanish context, or are you using it in an English context? And that may help to begin to at least create the kind of conversations that we need to have, as opposed to talking past each other, that we're talking with each other to try to understand how to deal with the concepts that we're articulating. But thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I really just once again want to say thank you. Maria very much had the same experience of, being one of the onlys in the room. So folks like you and professors, what you're doing for our students is extremely important to me, and that's why we stood up ALAS. So we do want to make sure that those of you who are alumni or will become alumni shortly, continue to be represented at Vanderbilt and continue to do that work. So with that, I want to say thank you guys for joining us today. We will continue to have these conversations, and we're so glad for the vigorous discussion that we've had today and so many things. We look forward to seeing you guys in person again soon, but in the interim, we're going to continue to do things like this over Zoom. So please do continue to be involved. And again, we'll be having a session on how you can get more involved in February. So I hope you guys will join us then. Thank you guys for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.